Hey, deserving listeners, I thought I would answer some of your patron emails. This email is from annual long-term anonymous patron. She says, would it be unethical for your past therapists to listen to your podcast? Thanks, EOE, or end of email. So the question is, would it be unethical for your past therapists to listen to your podcast, to my podcast? Well, at first, reading this question, I think it's a typo that you meant past clients. But if I were to answer this as it's written, which is also possible, the key here is that we must understand what ethics are trying to get at, which is harm. The ethical codes are there to prevent harm and to give us a guide regarding managing the risk of harm. Because a lot of things in therapy do risk harm to the clients, but we have to balance that with the justification to do so. Like if we enter into PTSD treatment of any sort with a client, there is a risk of harm, but it is justified, usually, case-by-case basis, by the fact that the research shows that the treatment models that have been researched to work, if used by a competent therapist, most of the time, there's tremendous benefit. So there is a justification to risking that harm. Now, obviously, if there's just not only risk, but actual harm of a client, then that's a whole other story. But typically, when we're thinking about ethical codes, ethical decision-making, questions on the internet about is this ethical or not, usually we're in that limbo zone of possible harm, risk of harm, right? So, for example, when I am given presentations on this podcast or as a professor or in workshops or something, and I provide a case example, there is a risk of harm. I could harm the client that I'm talking about because I could break confidentiality. I could represent the profession in a bad way and cause people to not want to go to therapy, that sort of thing. But when it comes to the justifications of providing a case example, we would, have that decision-making process of, well, what can I do to mask the identity? But whenever you talk about a client, even if you change details, there's always a risk, right? There's even a risk of a client misidentifying themselves, even if you're just making up a story, right? So that risk also needs to be considered. Just because you in your mind don't think you're talking about a particular client, that doesn't mean that a client that could reasonably think that they were being identified, it doesn't mean that they can't complain about you or sue you even. So we have to have guidelines about how we justify that. Well, the decision-making process is such that before I'm about to include a case example in my outline or my curriculum, I ask myself, is it worth it? Is it worth these risks? Now, the risks are pretty small if you take precautions, but it's still a risk. Well, the justification is education will be enhanced, and therefore the public or other clinicians will be enhanced, benefited, so that they can go out and do good, or the general public can be normalized with their issue if I'm talking about a similar issue or something like that. So these are the ways that we make decisions. So if I were to answer the question, is it unethical for a past therapist of mine to listen to my podcast? The question we have to ask is, would it harm me? Does it risk harm of me for one of my past therapists to listen to my podcast? And the answer is maybe. It does possibly risk harm, because if one of my past therapists were to listen to a lot of my episodes, or even just one episode, and then I want to go back to them and engage in therapy again, then having listened to my podcast, the therapist might be biased, right? Or they might be insulted by, if I talk shit about them or something, So it is a consideration, right? Now, is that likely? No, it's extremely unlikely for a past therapist, if they were to listen to one of my podcasts, episodes to be significantly harm or affected in a way that would cause harm to me. You could even say that it would benefit because if I ever did return to them, they would already be up to speed on a lot of things in my life, or at least they would be familiar with me. And so we could maybe accelerate through the first phases of therapy. We wouldn't have to become reacquainted, right? So that could be a justification in that scenario. But I don't know a single person that would even have a yellow flag if they heard a colleague listening to a past client's podcast. You know what I mean? Now, if I am right that this is a typo, which I'm beginning to think it wasn't, but is it unethical for a past client or a current client of mine to listen to my podcast? That's a completely different scenario, right? Because it's not harm to me that we're worried about. We're worried about harm to the client, to the listener. And I have been thinking about this even well before I even published my very first episode 17 years ago, because I'm a stickler for this sort of thing, and there are literally no guidelines out there about this sort of thing, because it takes forever in psychology to catch up to society. And so we just don't have anything out there that is a viable guide. So that's why I wrote my own white paper that's available on the website to address this. I did a lot of research. I gave it a lot of thought. I looked at the various ethical codes, and given my experience with a variety of content provision, I felt like I was in a unique position to be able to provide that discussion and that best practice, recommendation. And a part of the reason why I wrote that white paper was just for my own benefit, because nothing existed out there. And as I was becoming more popular, I became more and more worried about being sued. And the way that we protect ourselves as clinicians is that if we are sued or there is a complaint, we're able to point to a set of guidelines or policies or research or literature or guidance from supervision or something. We can point to some area within our field that gave us the justification for why we did X, Y, and Z. Well, since that doesn't exist for therapy individuals, psychologists on the internet, that are heavily involved in podcasting and YouTubing and tweeting and that sort of thing. Since nothing like that existed, if I ever did receive a complaint, I would not have that ability to protect myself. Plus, by writing a white paper, I can formalize and explore and determine really what the guidelines are. And I wrote that paper. But another reason why I wrote it was because I was starting to supervise other clinicians who were providing content on the internet. And that's a whole other ball of wax, right? Because if they're out there doing random things and I'm not there micromanaging, which I don't do as a supervisor, then how can I be assured that I've communicated to them what they need to be doing, what guidelines they need to follow? And I wrote the white paper. The beginning of the inspiration to write the white paper was at first I was just going to write up a little policy for supervision, but then it grew into an official kind of document. And so that was another reason. But the question, if a past client of mine or a current client of mine were to listen to my podcast, could it harm a client? Yeah, it could. There's a greater risk of harm about that than harm to me as a client if a past therapist or a current therapist were to listen to the podcast. I'm trying to remember if my past therapist did listen to my podcast. I have a feeling maybe. I don't remember talking about it much. It wouldn't have really pertained to what we were talking, because what we talk about in therapy is like deep emotional wounds and, all the things that you do, and the sort of academic and podcastery stuff that I get into. It's not really relevant to that. But anyway, although I have gone through bouts of emotional turmoil in relation to the podcast that I could have talked about, but didn't. Anyway, so could it harm a current client of mine? Yeah, if I talked about something, and I think about this all the time, not only as I'm prepping, as I'm recording, as I'm editing, I will edit stuff out sometimes with the thought of, that's too risky. I could harm a client. And there's various different ways in which a client could be harmed that I lay out in my white paper, but just as a off-the-head summary, one is that, say I was to say something political and a client felt unsafe with me for whatever reason, or if I attacked a group of people like Republicans or something like that, then that would obviously interfere with treatment. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that treatment has been harmed, which is the harm that we're thinking about with a client. Because, if I just say something insulting about Republicans and a client is, their feelings are hurt, that is kind of harm, but that's not often the harm that we're thinking about. Because, people have their feelings hurt sometimes. The real harm that we're thinking about is, clients are hiring us to work on something, and we are providing treatment to achieve that goal. So if treatment is harmed, that's mainly what we're concerned about, because that's our ethical responsibility as to their treatment. We're not ethically responsible necessarily for their feelings or for making sure that they have self-esteem in their identifications, like their political identification or something. It can, but sometimes people confuse that. They're like, oh, it's unethical to say something insulting about a client because their feelings are hurt and therefore harm has occurred and therefore you've been unethical. It's not really how it works. It can work that way, but generally speaking, like I said, we're thinking about treatment. So if the treatment is harmed, which could absolutely happen, right? Even if I do everything right as a treatment provider, a client could just be standoffish, mistrust me, not feel safe around me, even though they are safe around me, but because I said something, it could lead to that. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't be addressed, right? If I said something insulting and a client were to bring it up and we were to repair that rupture, it can be actually a very therapeutic moment. Now, that requires the client to bring it up, which is asking a lot. Sometimes I might even bring up stuff myself, and I've done that as a therapist. I might know that a client listens to the podcast, and I might get out ahead of something and say, hey, there's an episode coming up that I just want to make sure that we talk about it beforehand, because I don't, I'm trying to think of a scenario where specifically this happened, but maybe like, let's see, where I talk about my own emotional ups and downs. And if I knew a client listened to the podcast, or I suspected, and if I thought that client would become overly concerned about me and my feelings, and that would interfere with their treatment and having the sessions be about them and not about me, then yeah, I might get out ahead of that for sure. So, is it unethical for those things to happen? We typically can't answer that without actually getting into a case-by-case basis. So yeah, all right, let's take a break. Another email. All right, this next question is from YouTube member and annual long-term highest tier patron Jamie from South Korea. Just chiming in here first, Jamie, thank you for being all those things. YouTube member, annual patron, long-term patron, and highest tier patron. That's really quite a thing. So thank you. You're the wind beneath my wings. So you write in and say, hello, I have been listening to your deep dive on Boehnian therapy, and I have a question about triangulation. Could you tell us more about the difference between venting to someone versus triangulating someone into the tension? Could you tell us more about the difference between venting to someone versus triangulating someone into the tension? I have been venting a lot about my family member to my partner recently. My intention of venting is to get my feelings out when the trigger comes up, and I'm not expecting him to take any sides. It has been very helpful to talk it out with him to process my feelings about my family. And I also check in with him if he's okay with me venting so much, which he says he is okay with. He agrees with my frustrations around my family, and I do not believe that my venting will ruin his relationship with my family member, but I'm concerned that I'm trying to triangulate him into the tension. Thank you. End of email. Yeah, this is a great question, and it is answered fairly simply, which is to say that I have an approach to triangulation that I think is maybe a little particular. I'm trying to remember if I got this from other people. I typically don't hear people talking this way, but I expand the definition of triangulation for this reason into two different categories, functional and dysfunctional. Because when I was learning about triangulation in my early career, I kept running into this question that you had. And I wondered about, well, isn't therapy triangulation? When I have an individual client sit on my couch and complain about their husband, aren't I being triangulated somehow? So is all triangulation a problem? And to some extent, the original Murray Bowen perspective was essentially that, because he came from a very enmeshed family that bitched about each other all the time. There was a lot of complaining and a lot of people talking shit behind other people's backs. And he didn't like that. I think correctly there's a whole paper where he wrote anonymously at first and then later claimed ownership of this very famous seminal article about him going down a process of de-triangulating and becoming more differentiated in his family of origin. And a big part of it was for him to deny the opportunity for triangulation. Someone would come to him complaining about another family member, and he would go directly to that other family member and just repeat everything that the other person said. And this and it's more complicated than that, but at the very least, this stopped people triangulating him, right? So he had a particular point of view, which was, I think, a little radical at first, which was you should never talk about someone else if they're not in the room, that kind of thing. It's a simple way of putting it. But ever since then, contemporary Bowenian people will have a more nuanced point of view, of course, but I found that the language just wasn't very helpful. Even the word differentiation isn't a very good word for it, because it emphasizes the difference and the pushing someone away from you, right? Gaining some independence, right? That's what he needed, because that's what he was suffering from in his family of origin, was a lack of differentiation. But in contemporary circles, differentiation is also the ability to get close to people. And Bowen talked about this as well. It's just copy. But anyway, so I like to, whenever I'm talking about triangulation, one of the first assessment angles to take is it functional or dysfunctional? I define dysfunctional as that, which is the definition of triangulation. It's not mine, but I'm labeling it dysfunctional in that it's triangulation that results in perpetuation or increasing the tension, the anxiety, as Bowen called it. So for you, Jamie, you have tension between you and a family member. So you and this family member are in conflict, have tension, resentment, anger, hurt feelings, that sort of thing, right? And there's tension there. So you are naturally going to want to talk with your partner about this, because it's a part of, that's what support is, right? And the question is that triangulation process with your partner functional or dysfunctional? And you laid it out really well, that you answered all the questions because you listened to the deep dive, right? So one of the things that you say here is that it's not ruining his relationship with the family member. That is one of the markers, right? Because that would just be moving the tension from one relationship to another. So if you had tension with this family member, and then by you venting to your partner that all the things, and then you're now relieved because you have vented, well, if it's a fused or undifferentiated system with undifferentiated, relatively undifferentiated individuals, then your partner would take on the tension and would have a really, intense conflict with this other family member. Now, that isn't always a bad thing, right? Like if my wife were to have someone that was extremely harmful to her, hurtful to her, or abusive or something, and then she vented to me about it, and then I absorbed some of that tension, and now I hate that person too. It's not necessarily dysfunctional, right? It kind of depends on the situation. But a classic example is that you vent to your partner, and then the next time you're at a family gathering, your partner is standoffish or even openly conflictual with the person, and then you go home, and now you are the person that your family member and your partner are venting to, and the cycle just goes on and on. The original tension or the inherent or the ongoing tension in the system is not being resolved. It's just being transmuted between different relationships. So that's Murray Bowen's genius observation that, okay, fine, you've resolved this one conflict, but the conflict has just shifted somewhere else, and it'll come back around to you is the thing. So you're smart and wise to assess for that and mention in your email. It's like, well, my partner doesn't hate this family member, so this isn't moving the tension around the system. The other thing that you address in your email is you say he's okay. I asked him, are you okay with me venting? And he's okay. So I'm not like coercing him or bothering him or something like that. So there's that. You also mention that it's been very helpful to talk it out because you're processing your feelings about your family. Now, I don't know how that exactly is helping precisely, but it sounds to me like it is in the functional side because maybe it's giving you perspective. Maybe just by venting, you're more free to explore options, avenues to take with the family member. Maybe it's drawing a boundary. Maybe it's being nicer in your mind. Maybe you're biased about the family member, or maybe going to the family member and having a conversation about it, that kind of thing. So, but at the very least, if it's not causing, like, let's say that, in this triangulation between your family member and your partner, that the tension between you and the family member never really gets that much better. Well, as long as, well, let me think about this, because under the definition, it would be a dysfunctional triangulation, but I think it kind of depends. Maybe this is why you're asking the question. Well, I guess, so if I were in your shoes, this is what I'd be thinking. I'd be thinking, what's the overall picture here, and what do I want? Differentiation has to do with what we call goal-directed behavior, which is not only to think on the meta level of like, what's my goal here? Not only that, but also to take action in that direction. So if you have a goal, so you have to define what the goal is. Is the goal to make the relationship better with the family member? Or is your goal to just be happy overall in life, whether that involves this family member or not, so there's that. Or is the goal to, just make life as easy as possible? There's various different, and maybe you have all these goals, but how is the differentiation level in the family, in the system, and also within you, within your relationship with your partner, within your, differentiation exists on the systemic level and on the individual level anyway. So how is the differentiation level involved in managing you reaching your goal? So if you have a goal of surviving family get-togethers and you don't really care about resolving any issues with the family member, then differentiation will play a role, and that will tell you whether or not the triangulation is functional or not. So if your goal is to survive and you don't have any aspirations of improving your relationship with this family member, then your description of the triangulation with your partner is functional because it is giving you that ability to meet that goal, which is to survive, right? Now, if the goal is to improve the relationship with your family member, then you would have to evaluate that over time, because there's a possibility that by you venting to your partner that you have this temporary relief, and he's so relieving to you that you are too afraid of facing the relationship with your family member, given your differentiation level, or the general lack of differentiation in the family results in you never actually doing anything to improve the relationship with your family member, then one could argue that your triangulation with your partner is a part of the overall dysfunctional pattern, because he could be triangulated in a different way, or you could involve him in a different way. Like, he could, instead of being a very good listener and very supportive, he could say something like, well, have you ever thought about actually talking with this person about it? Or, well, I think you kind of contributed to that one, and maybe it's partly your fault that that conflict happened. Giving you an opportunity to see, oh, maybe there's an avenue there so that I can go down either individually or with that family member to actually improve the relationship. So case by case basis. All right, another break. All right, back from the break. So the way I ended that last email segment, I was just thinking, as soon as I clicked pause on the recording, I had this whole kind of paragraph of thought that went through my mind, which was, I initially wondered if the way that I signed off before the break, if I sounded dismissive or exasperated or annoyed or something. And then that blossomed into the rest of the paragraph, which was that I've had 2 moments lately in which people watching me on YouTube will tell me that I seem exasperated, or not. That word has been used, but other words have been used, and this is pretty small, but I want to just get out ahead of it. But before that, maybe I should just define it. So there were 2 moments in the past few months where people were consuming my content, and they told me that it seemed like I didn't really want to be doing the content, if that makes sense. And I just want to say that I am sufficiently healthy and slightly unhealthily narcissistic to the point where I don't do anything I don't want to do. So if I'm doing it, I want to do it. And I love making content. So if I'm ever, so that prompted me to have a conversation with my wife, because she watches all the videos. She doesn't listen to any of the audio podcasts, by the way, but she does watch all the videos. And I asked her, do I ever seem like I'm exasperated? And she's pretty honest with me, and she said no. And this isn't the first time that I've heard people thinking that I'm feeling or thinking things and I'm not in this direction. Like, it's been a long time since I've had someone say this to me, something like this to me, but I'm trying to remember. Maybe it was as a professor that I would hear a student say something like, yeah, when I first had you as a professor, I thought you were really annoyed with me or something. I was really scared of you. And then over time I realized, oh no, you're a really warm person. That wasn't very often, but it happened enough. And sometimes I think it was just the fact that I was a professor, because there would be times when I would be doing everything in my power to make a student feel comfortable, and they would just still be intimidated by me because I held the mantle of professor, and they were transferring, which is fine. We all do that. But I do think that, if I think about the opposite, right? People who are really jubilant and non-irritatable. I'm definitely not that, right? So I think that there's a possibility, which would mortify me, that if anyone ever thought that, of you listening, that at any point when I'm making content that I am exasperated or that I don't want to be making the content. Because that, as a listener, if I was a listener, it would bum me out, it would concern me, it would bother me. I'd be like, well, why are you making content if you don't want to do it? Like, just don't do it, pal. And I just want to get out ahead of that, say, no. Believe me, there are times when I will be doing something podcast related or YouTube channel related, and I don't want to do it, and I do not do it. I don't even start the process because I'm that selfish, if you want, or that self-esteemed, or that aware of what I want, or that entitled, or that boundaried, whatever pro or con you want to put to it, because there are pros and cons to it. So I be assured that I'm into it. Now, I think the pro to me, being how I am in this way, is that I'm not afraid to exhibit my irritability or my annoyance with something, or my anger. There's different approaches to making content, but some people don't do that. I find a lot of content providers don't do that kind of thing. They might say that they're angry, but they don't exhibit anger, and that's fine. And I appreciate that style in a lot of content providers, but I don't. How do I guess I would say that I just made a decision a number of years ago that the Venn diagram of like what I want to do with what I think the audience would like to see or hear, the overlapping regions of the Venn diagram involves me being somewhat that way at times, if that makes sense. Anyway, let's read another email. All right, this next email is from listener Kat. She writes in and says, "Hi, Kirk. In the Love is Blind Season 7, number 58 video, you talked about Nick, perhaps, so I think it's Nick D, Nick Dorka, Nick Dork. Kirk talked about Nick perhaps having a detached sense of self due to his past aspirational pro athlete training." Just chiming in. Yeah, so if you're not aware, there was this one individual cast member on Love is Blind who seemed to exhibit, and I think he even talked about it, that he would detach from his sense of self and had a hard time knowing what he wanted and how he felt and his needs. And in the show, the way it looked was he was being walked on by, I don't use the word abusive lightly, but by a partner that was being abusive or very, very hurtful and callous towards him. And I wondered about how that personality trait developed, or the lack of a personality trait developing, of being in a connection with yourself and just noticing when you're being mistreated. I wondered if his sports training was involved in that, because he was a punter in the NFL at one time, or he was trying to be a punter in the NFL, I think. Anyway, and in today's sports, you have to do it 24/7 typically. It's not like the old days in the, like in the 70s. I remember there was this running back for the Seattle Seahawks that I really liked. Oh, I can't remember his name. It had, I think his number was 33. But anyway, he was an NFL running back, which is one of the most important positions on the field, particularly in the 70s, since there's a lot more run-oriented. And from my memory, he was planning on playing the NFL after college for a few years, and then he was going to pursue his dream of becoming a medical physician, and he was going to go back to med school, and that's what he did. And today, now that happens occasionally, right? If you have some second string cornerback or something, sometimes that happens. But typically, these are individuals that, especially running backs and that sort of thing, who have been dedicating their entire life to it ever since they were like 5 years old. And by the time they're done with the NFL, they have no idea what they're going to do, which has its own issues with it. But anyway, so I was wondering if Nick, because, we had learned that he was a successful potential professional athlete, if, that contributed. But anyway, Kat says, "I would love to hear more about this. I was training as a professional flutist with aspirations of playing in an orchestra. I completely just chiming in here. Yeah, that's another area that is extremely competitive, is orchestra musicianship. I learned that kind of the hard way, because when I was in my bachelor's degree at University of Washington, I really wanted to enter the music department. And so a lot of my classes that I could choose, my electives, I always took these music classes, theory, but I also took composition, and there would be like 5 students around a piano and we'd be writing songs, and the kinds of things I would hear from the other students, because they were all music majors and I was this outsider. The kinds of things I would hear from them, I just like, oh my God, this sounds horrible. The way they're treated, the competition, the scrutiny, it didn't seem fun at all, which is why I liked music. But and so I imagine that rising the rank. Now, if you want to become a professional flutist, like in an orchestra for a musical or something, I think there's a different kind of thing. It can still be very competitive and can be nasty. In fact, I think there was a This American Life episode about this, some sort of podcast episode. And if I remember right, the thing that everyone knows if you're in an ongoing orchestra is that everyone hates each other or something. Was that like, anyway, and this also can be a very difficult job because you're literally playing the same 5 parts, day in and day out, and it becomes extremely annoying. Anyway, going on. I completely resonate with this topic, and since quitting the flute, I have been trying to regain my old passions that I had put aside. I was forced to give up many hobbies, relationships, and experiences during my developmental years. I would be greatly interested to hear more about this, as I know it's a very prevalent issue for ex-musicians like myself. End of email. Yeah, and this is a broader topic. I've talked about this before, like psychology of sports injury or something. I had a student that I think I was talking with about it. It's been a number of years. But yeah, it's getting worse in our society. I have noticed it getting extremely worse. There was a time, when I was growing up, the competition was there, and there were some people, like I had a friend, my Vietnamese friend, who would have fit in very well in today's world. He would have been normal, but he was abnormal to us in the late 80s in that he and his family were solely focused on making sure that he got into a prestigious Ivy League university. He ended up going to Brown, I believe. I'm pretty sure. And everything was sacrificed for it. He couldn't hang out with friends. He was a friend of ours, a good friend of ours, but he could only be friends with us at school in between classes. He never hung out with us after school. The one time, and me and my friends got together, 5 times a week, and he never was able to go out with us because his parents, and to some extent he kind of agreed with it, that high school is not for having friends. It's for becoming valedictorian, which is what he became, and all that stuff. But anyway, so there's way more of that today. And is it inherently harmful? No. Can you raise a kid well that has balance? Yeah. But when it comes to the academic achievement or sports achievement or musical achievement, dance achievement, these things can easily spin out of control. Gymnastics, becoming an Olympic hopeful. These kinds of things are, I worry about almost whenever I watch the Olympics with young people, like in gymnastics, or I hear about a kid that is getting straight A's and, he graduated high school early. I'm never happy. I don't know automatically, right? Just hearing the story, because, maybe they do have balance and they have just been able to strike that balance. But I'm almost always bummed out by it. And I'm imagining just the sacrifices that you're talking about and the kinds of things that are extremely important to happiness and well-being, and having the well-rounded psychology so that you can meet your needs. And a lot of these pursuits require the individual, and remember these are children, to actively deny their needs. This is something that's really well understood in the gymnastics community, right? And this was all illuminated by the scandal that we talked about with Larry Nassar, and we did a deep dive on that. And you have these kids that are striving to become a gymnast, and if you ask them, do you want to be practicing 7 days a week? They would say, yes, I love it. And they do. But, they're kind of a product of their environment. Their parents are oriented that way. The child is in the gymnastics world, which of course is very oriented that way. And they, as they're flipping about and often hurting themselves, not only just by landing wrong, but also just by the overuse of certain joints, they hit a crossroads where some kids will say, this is too much. I don't like this. If I'm constantly in pain and I'm constantly having to watch what I eat and I'm constantly practicing all the time, there are other things in life, aren't there? And I just would rather do something else. Well, those kids do drop out or take another route. But the kids that stay in it, that succeed, are the ones that denied themselves. They said, I have to deny. And then, there's always some sacrifice, right? No pain, no gain. But for the very successful ones, and I imagine in the musical world it might be similar to this, they reach that Y in the road, and for whatever reason, internally and externally, they decide that they are going to deny their needs. And the repetition of that results in these symptoms that we see, where you have Larry Nassar, who for decades is sexually abusing these children under the guise of providing medical treatment. And so you have all these girls that are used to denying their body. They're used to denying their own needs. They're used to not asking for help. They're used to saying, well, coach knows best. And then a predator can get in there. And you have parents that are used to watching their kids suffer, and it's all for the greater good of being in the Olympics or something. And you see these sensational cases, but what it is just the tip of the iceberg of not necessarily like a bunch of sexual abuse that's happening, although I imagine it is. The iceberg that is under the surface is just the massive amount of denial of these individuals' needs and their personalities and the development that they're not going through and the experiences that they need, So much of development occurs between those experiences. I remember when my little brother was trying to decide where he was going to go to school, and my parents were kind of concerned. There was this Y in the road where he wanted to go to a college that was a couple hours away, and it was a state college, actually a community college, so it was totally affordable. But my parents were thinking, well, it would be a lot cheaper if he just lived at home and he went to college at the local community college, Bellevue Community College. And my parents weren't fighting. Everyone was just kind of like, oh, let's kind of look at this. And my parents asked me for advice because I had been through it 5 or 7 years earlier or something, that decision. And I said adamantly that 99% of what I learned had to do with me not living at home, had to do with me having to figure out life and relationships and manage all the things you have to manage independently when you don't live at home. It's interesting that my parents had a different approach at that point, because when I was when I was at that crossroad, about to graduate from high school, I actually wanted to live at home. Because the university I was going to was a half an hour away, the University of Washington. So I was just like, well, why don't I just live at home? Because my mom does my laundry, she cooks for me, she cleans for me, and I have my room, and everything's kind of relaxed and comfortable and nameable. I know it's not chaotic or unpredictable. And my mom and my sister both said, no, 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 you have to live on campus. I'm laughing because it's just like, I wonder which kid they liked better, my little brother or me. They would, I don't feel that way at all. I felt eternally loved and still do. But I guess the difference, and did I ask my parents about it? I guess the simplest answer is, well, my little brother was the last kid, and after him was an empty nest. So maybe that was the anxiety, or they just changed their ideas of what was best about college, or they saw the chaos that I got into it in my bachelor's degree and said, maybe these experiences that kids have when they move out of the house and go to college, maybe that isn't like what's best. Anyway, at any rate, it's getting worse and worse, and I am seeing, because back when in the 70s and 80s, it was a rare thing, right? It was for those tiger moms, so to speak, tiger parents, like my Vietnamese friends' parents, who were lovely people, but that was a very rare thing. In fact, I knew another guy. I mean, Brian Yorkie, if you're familiar, I don't think he was getting pressure from his family, though. He was just a genius and just had really high aspirations for himself. And he did, I think he went to Columbia. I'm not sure. Whereas the 99.999% of the rest of us, including myself, who got straight A's and was at the top of my class in math and physics and that kind of stuff, and had all the resources that I could go. In fact, I would get pamphlets from schools trying to recruit me from, Ivy League kind of schools. And I was just like, why would I want to do that? Who cares what school I go to? Education, knowledge is knowledge. It's not like these Ivy League schools have specific knowledge, right? It's just, and plus the University of Washington is a pretty good school. So anyway, now God bless, if you want to go to a nice school. But now I will be hanging out with suburban, the average suburban family in the Seattle area anyway, and everyone is talking the way that my Vietnamese friend was talking about, like, even the kids. The kids will be like 15, and they're like, oh, okay, so here's my top schools, and they're all like prestigious, expensive, out-of-state schools. And, God bless if that's what you want to do. But the idea of going to like the local state school, like University of Washington, is abhorrent to a lot of these people. It's just like, well, that's what basic people do. That's what people do that aren't serious. That's what losers do. And I'm generalizing, of course, but it is kind of that way. And so I'm quite sure that in the music arena and in the sports arena, I see those things getting worse and worse as well. You have kids that will, when we were kids, and this is just Gen X shaking fist at, today people, but I think it's worth talking about that. When we were kids and we played soccer, for example, it was just for fun. Yeah, sure. We wanted to get better. We wanted to win, but we didn't live and breathe it, right? And everyone was like that. Like, there wasn't a single kid or team in my town that took it any more seriously than everyone took it the same level of seriousness, which was pretty minimal. There was no off-season training at all. We would show up for the first day of practice and run some drills and kind of muddle our way through a game. And, it was a big deal. There was ups and downs, and I have a lot of memories from that. But as soon as the season was over, it was over. Now you have kids, they're playing year-round. They're on all-star teams. They're traveling all over the place. Again, God bless if that's what, but I question whether or not that is what's best for these kids and their development, because so much of what happens in development happens between all those scheduled things, happens when you just have free time to hang out with your friends and watch YouTube or walk to the store, or you're on the phone talking about your crush on David Bowie or something, to date myself. those are the, and you don't plan those, and there's not an all-star team of like gossipers on the phone, but those are, I mean, when I think about the things that contributed to my well-being and my development as a human being, it's all that stuff. None of it has to do with academics. It has to do with sports, honestly, but not achievement in sport, but the experiences, the camaraderie, the love, the bond, the working hard, losing. Most of the teams I was on, we lost. And so I had to learn how to lose gracefully, how to lose and still try the next week, still try just as hard, not give up, not give in to the cynicism of this team sucks, that kind of thing. And so yeah, and if I was, so if maybe some kids today are extremely oriented towards one sport, and maybe they also are learning a lot of those lessons, but I would just hope that they would just have balance, Now, there are plenty of kids that are all-star on a soccer team, and they have very rich social lives, maybe with their teammates. So I'm not, there's really case-by-case basis, but it really, the one area where I'm almost always bummed out is when I hear about a kid at 14 is already thinking about Ivy League schools, or I hear about a kid who's 10 and is already making plans to become like a professional athlete, and they're doing that sport around the clock. It's often what gives parents the most pride. My kid is going to an all-star national team of gymnasts or something. And whenever I hear that, I always go, oh gosh, I hope that kid's okay. And maybe the kid is okay. Maybe the kid is more than okay. I don't know. All right. Well, that does it for that episode. Everyone out, let me know what you think in the comments. Share your experience. Email me. And everyone out there, please, without any exasperation in my voice, take care of yourself, because you deserve it most wholeheartedly.